Today we have myself, D, we have App again, and we have Cast. So Cast, you want to take it?
So App, what's your social security number and when was the last time you had your period?
Well, you definitely don't get to know my social security number. And there aren't a whole lot of people that get to know when my last period was. You are not in that group.
Pseudo, when was your last period?
You don't have permission for that.
This incident will be reported.
So apparently there is some level of data privacy within our group, as well as relative to the rest of society. So today's topic is about data privacy and to what degree should data be shareable within society. So what do you guys think? Should we have, you obviously think that we should have limits on who gets to know what data, and probably you get to choose what data is and isn't shareable.
Right. That's definitely where I am. I am much more of the opinion that I want to give you data. I do not want you taking it from me.
Yeah, and I'm of the opinion that data should be as private as possible and protected to protect the people whose data that is, as a lot of that data could be dangerous to their well-being or to their identity, things like that. But much of that data is very useful if used in a safe context. So looking at
how the data is used is important.
Yeah, and there's a lot of good that can be taken from an aggregate of data.
And I think that the type of data is going to be the important distinction here. I think that data just exists in itself. How it's used is the important distinction. And the type of data determines how badly that data can be used. So with our initial example, social security number, that can be used for nefarious purposes. People can do identity theft and impersonate you, commit a crime, posing as you, and then get away with it while framing you for it. I think that that act should be protected against. So we should have laws that protect against identity theft. But that being said, the data itself isn't the problem. The social security number isn't the problem. It's the nefarious use of it. How could one nefariously use information of, I know when you last had your period? Can that be nefariously used?
Yeah.
In what way?
It's a terrible example, but planning a sexual assault.
That's true.
Yep. If you assaulted a woman during the right time of month, you could make her have a child and you would be forced to...
so data about ovulation times, and that is related to times that you're having your period.
Right. So it could be easy to get a woman pregnant, and in some states where rapists do have rights to the child conceived by rape, that's not a great situation.
That's absolutely fair. So is there any data that cannot be used nefariously?
I'm not sure that there is. I think that we as human beings are quite creative in our use of data, and as long as that data can be tied to a specific person, it could be used nefariously.
Whereas if it's anonymized, it becomes significantly more difficult, if not impossible, to use it nefariously.
If it's truly anonymized, which is really near impossible to do actually, but as anonymized as possible, then yeah, it loses its nefarious uses. But true anonymization means essentially getting rid of all of that data that you want to use and replacing it with something else.
And to stay with the sensitive topic, I know that particularly for women, period trackers are very frequently used. That data can be very, very helpful for learning about menstruation in the scientific community, learning about cycles, irregularities, medical conditions that are related to it. So that data can be very, very important for medical advancement, but that doesn't mean that your involvement with it is important at all. So the anonymized version of that data could actually be useful, but I see a major limitation of if you need to give permission for that, it can significantly hamper the medical community's advancements. Not just because it makes the data harder to access, but if it's an opt-in type of data, then if there's a certain type of person that has very irregular periods in this particular example, they may be more embarrassed to share it, but the irregularities can be more important than the regularities. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting point, because you kind of need to know what people are going to do with this data, even if it is anonymized, and just what the pool is going to look like. If we have a whole bunch of people with irregular periods that we're collecting data for, your 1 point isn't going to be as much of a concern. But if, say, you are the only one out of 10,000 data points, that makes it a whole lot more interesting.
Yeah. Now, and if it's not anonymized, they may say, hey, we want to do medical studies on you, in which case, well, that's going to be a direct invasion of privacy if they're forcing medical experiments on you.
Yeah, and you're thinking about individual, looking for those data points that are off from everyone else. But if you're looking for trends in that data, I'm definitely not completely remembering this example, but I believe it was in the 70s. There were a lot of drugs being used, prescription drugs being used that were being flushed down the toilets in New York City that were not being filtered out of the drinking water, so they would cycle back through, and
because they didn't know what drugs there were,
right, and they didn't know what the side effects would be, nor did they know if it was going to pass through the water filtration system. So all of these drugs made their way into the water supply, and there was a huge increase in when women's menstruation would begin, at which age younger and younger females would start to menstruate, and it was a real problem. And having the data like that could show really interesting things and help point to a source.
Sure, and even if it doesn't point necessarily to a source, realizing that there are trends happening, if people are very private about their information and data, and there is a distinction between data and information. Just as a quick clarification, data is just a single point. I'm trying to figure out a definition without using information or data. Information is interpreted data. That data on its own is not useful, but information is data that has been interpreted in a meaningful way, or at least brought together. So that when we're using those words in the future, that's what we're going to be referring to. You can have a single person starting their period really early is a point of data. 1,000 people all starting their period early is information. And from that, you can start to correlate, okay, what are some of the causes? And like I was saying earlier, I think that if it's an opt-in and not on by default, then
it can be hard to get enough people to sign up.
But the bigger problem is for those outlier cases can be incredibly important. Mm-hmm. That if you're looking for a latchkey piece of information where, all right, all of these people are affected by this, is there anyone that isn't nearby? If you start expanding out that search, eventually you'll find someone that isn't. You can find the boundary conditions to actually determine what those causes are or rule out what some of the possible causes are. So I think that for true usefulness of information and for data to be truly useful, it needs to be, again, where we don't overstep our bounds, it needs to be in everyone. If the data is being processed for some people, it should be processed for all people. I mean, I'm an equal opportunity data hoarder. And I think that data hoarding or data gathering is an important aspect that we need to know about, is who is gathering the data, because that matters.
Right. Because in the case that you were talking about there, you would want to have one entity collecting all of those data points so that you could actually analyze them.
Also known as Big Brother.
Yeah. And you made the point about you want to know who's collecting that data. But you also want to know how they're going to use it, how they plan to use it, and how they are storing it if it's secure, and how are they going to be sharing it. There's a lot of different things to think about here when considering who's going to hold your data.
And I was just about to ask, well, what do you mean? What are we worried about how they're using it? It's just data. It isn't in and of itself harmful, but it absolutely is. Great example. If you were in the 1930s, 1940s, living in Germany, and you had a piece of data that you happen to be Jewish, that in itself is not harmful. But when Nazis start saying, hey, we want to focus on this area of the population, that is absolutely a nefarious use, and you can have a lot of negative ramifications. Even though being Jewish isn't a negative ramification in and of itself, applied nefariously, it can be. So I agree that even harmless data can be used nefariously. Now, does that mean that we should not gather any data? Should data be completely locked down?
Well, that's an interesting point, talking about data being completely locked down, because that is one end of the spectrum of the data privacy discussion. We have the one end where everything's locked down and the only data that is shared or stored is done with the express consent of the person who owns that. So in my case, if someone asked me my social security number, I am the only one that could share it, and I would have full control of whoever sees that data, how they use it, and how it's stored, everything like that. That is one end of the spectrum where everything is protected completely, and the data is only available if I say so.
And for something like your social security number, that probably makes a lot of sense, because somebody taking your social security number can do a lot of damage.
And that's a particularly good example of social security numbers can very easily be used nefariously. That if you are using it and you are not the person that it belongs to, it is nefarious. Because social security numbers should only be used to verify identity. And if you are not using it just to check on a person's identity, that means that you're using it for another purpose and you are trying to impersonate that person for whatever reason it may be. It may just be, I want to look at information. I don't have access to the sudoers file, and I want to impersonate this person just to get more information. That in and of itself is illegal because you are using it for nefarious purposes. Although I'm kind of getting into cyclical logic here. So I think that we would agree that identity theft or identity impersonation is a lie. And I think we're running into our first real axiom here is that using data to impersonate another individual for directly lying
is bad. Identity theft is bad.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to generalize it as much as possible. That is that an axiom that we can't break down more? Can we get to something that is simpler than that? Or let's try and work around that. Is identity theft bad? So, for instance, I'm just thinking outside of the box here. Let's say someone is in a house. They are in a locked room, or they're locked inside of their house somewhere. The house is on fire. I'm trying to get in, but it's really locked down. And I happen to have the social security number I happen to have a code that I shouldn't know, but someone told it to me because data is openly available, and I can unlock the house.
Is that a nefarious purpose?
I'm trying to save their life, but I'm still impersonating another person. So impersonating another person to do an act of good could be considered good.
I think in this case, yes.
Particular case, yes. So, I mean, I realize it's a very weird example, but we can imagine a case where impersonating someone for the purpose of doing something good can be good. Problem is, how do you define the good act? Because saving that person from a burning building, well, that burning building, or the person in that burning building was Hitler. So...
yeah, that might change things a little bit there.
Actually, Hitler wasn't that bad. Let's say Mao. Let's say Mao Zedong is in the house and I'm trying to rescue him. Well, I'm trying to save his life, but he's Mao Zedong. By the way, if you don't know who Mao Zedong is, I'm not going to explain it here. Go get a history lesson. Look up Mao Zedong. Have fun. Hitler was nice compared to him. After all, everything, even evil, is relative. So I think it is important to say if we're committing a nefarious act, how is that related to if we're committing the nefarious act for an act of good? I don't think it's relevant. I think that performing the nefarious act in and of itself makes any subsequent action bad. Because if you can justify evil through a good action, and this is going to be a whole podcast in and of itself, if you can justify a good action if you can justify an evil or bad action with the justification of good, you can define any action as good. So and I don't want that tool to be used. If I use that tool, then people that I disagree with can use that tool against me. And I don't want anything to devolve into everyone using nefarious acts.
So I think it's important to break down in your example, breaking into a burning building by pretending to be someone that you're not in order to save a life, although that life is Mao Zedong. There isn't just one action here. It is multiple. Pretending to be a person and breaking into that building is bad. Saving a life is good. Saving Mao Zedong's life, depends on which point.
I'm willing to say that's bad.
Yeah. So there are multiple actions here, and when we're considering something, if it's going to be good or bad or where on the spectrum it falls, it's important to break it down into those individual pieces, because I can do 10 things in a day as part of a single task. One of them could be bad and 9 could be good. But that doesn't make it doesn't make my task good or bad specifically. It was mostly good. The
tasks are independent, is what you're saying.
Yeah, but the individual actions that made up that task should be the ones that are judged.
So in to kind of follow along the example of breaking into a house to save someone's life, should the breaking into the house be prosecuted?
I believe property damage is completely, in my opinion, I believe the opinion of the law in the U.S. at least, causing property damage in order to save a life is completely acceptable and within the law.
Now, the owner of the house probably could try to press charges, and depending on their lawyers, they may actually get somewhere.
Yeah, but I think it's generally accepted that me busting down a door in order to save a life is not a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, the fire department would do that in your example if they were coming in.
And they have tools specifically to be able to do that. So what kind of an axiom can we get to in terms of nefarious acts? That is an act based in a lie. Should we accept that as nefarious and therefore bad? Is that the axiom? An act that uses someone's data or information specifically for the purpose of impersonation. That's the lie that I'm talking about. That if you are impersonating another person, is that axiomatically bad?
How about the use of data with malicious intent is bad?
What defines malicious intent? If I think I'm doing good, is that a malicious intent? And we can't just say, oh, well, that's not what the data was intended to be used for, because that's not what data is. Mm-hmm. I can have data about myself. The fact that I have a nose is a piece of data. I don't know how that can be used, so I can't give permission, which means any use of that data would be malicious intent. So that wouldn't be a valid definition.
So trying to find the wording here, but something along the lines of the use of data in order to harm another person in any way is bad.
I'm using data to find the location of Mao Zedong to kill him.
I would say that the act of murder, no matter who it is wrong, but Mao Zedong is
He's an extreme example. Okay.
Yeah.
I hear screams from another room. I assume that someone is being murdered. I am using that point of data to find which room it's in so that I can go stop that person and potentially harm them in the process.
Your intent is not to harm, not necessarily to harm the person. Right. It's to stop the harm.
And use minimum necessary force.
Yeah.
Which, again, minimum necessary force and self-defense, that will be another episode. So we can get more into detail there. But again, I'm just trying to boil things down to what is an axiom that we can agree on. And it sounds like, because evil is a point of view, Anakin.
Yeah. But the use of data to cause harm to another person is wrong or bad.
What if you're not trying to cause harm to the other person? So, for instance, identity theft and stealing someone's credit card number, you're not trying to cause harm to them. You're just trying to benefit from something that you don't normally have access to.
Well, you are meaning to cause harm because you have to understand what you're doing to that person with their data.
Maybe you actually don't, like, you find someone's credit card. You don't know, let's say a 14-year-old finds a credit card and doesn't realize that credit reports are a thing, and starts using it to buy a bunch of stuff, buy a bunch of toys, and doesn't end up paying it off.
That's wrong.
It's wrong, but they wouldn't be using it nefariously, or at least with active malicious intent. They're not trying to hurt another person, but they are hurting that person in the process.
I think they, well, as if they are old enough to understand what a credit card is and how to use it, they should understand
Not necessarily.
that. Well, they should not necessarily the point of the credit report, but they should understand that this is someone else's credit card and it is in some way equivalent to money.
But that idea of this is someone else's and stealing, that's something that we axiomatically teach.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, I mean, there are a lot of really nitpicky facets that we're trying to work around here, but what is the minimum level of limitation that we can have on data in terms of what is a bad use of data axiomatically? That's the question that I'm trying to get at.
Really, I still stand by and say that
if you are actively trying to hurt someone.
Well, if you are, I'm not saying actively. I'm saying if the use of data to harm another person,
whether or not it's intentional. So, if I use data in a way that, even though I didn't intend for it to harm someone, and I explicitly was not aware that it would harm them, but it did cause harm to them, that I am liable for that harm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
All right, so I'm going to make an attempt at boiling this down. The use of data in such a way that it harms a person or their livelihood is bad.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Regardless of the intent, the outcome is what's important.
Yeah. And whether or not the like certain actions when using the data are like they may be forgivable, but it does come down to, I guess, the laws on what is or isn't, what falls into the category, and what the person whose data, or really what the person who was harmed in that.
For instance, depending on malicious intent, murder is different than manslaughter.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And use of data can be similar, that if you steal someone's identity and you legitimately didn't know it was wrong and you can somehow prove that, then that should be treated differently in the court of law than if you were trying to steal someone's identity for the purpose of framing them for murder.
Well, let's say accidental stolen identity. I'm filling out a form and
your name is very similar to someone else's.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Or I accidentally, maybe dyslexia, I put down the wrong social security number that I swear I put down mine, but I put down someone else's, and it goes through and it starts whatever I'm doing, even though I don't realize it, is harming them. I think that's bad.
And if you have a bad credit report and then that's associated mm-hmm. with their social security number, if that causes monetary damages, you may be responsible for that mistake that you made.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I could claim ignorance.
And I can agree with that. I think that seems reasonable.
Yeah. But it's not necessarily intent to harm. It is causing harm. That's bad.
It's the effect.
Yeah.
The effect is more important than the motive.
Yeah. In this case.
Which, in this case, I agree with that. I can't say I agree with that overall, but that's, again, another topic in and of itself. So we can come back to that at a separate point. All right. So I think that we've gotten this axiom at least narrowed down, that it's the effect and not necessarily the intent that matters. Agreed?
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool.
There's one more point I want to make on that, is that this is for another podcast, but if intent is also bad, the effect is bad too.
Yes.
So
but they are bad in separate ways, and I think intent/motive is something that we'll cover in another topic.
But a related but not the same axiom is the intent to cause harm is bad.
I would generally agree with that. The degree to which it's equal to the harm, I think that that's up for debate. But again, that will be a separate topic. For now, I would really, really like to talk about the Borg, because I think that they are a good absolute example of literally no data privacy whatsoever. Everyone hears every single thought that you have. And we're not going to talk about the idea of collectivism versus individuality. That is also another topic that we're going to be covering. But in terms of data, not data as in the character that fought the Borg, also different. Data and information in a society where data privacy literally does not exist. What are some of the inherent detriments in that type of society?
I mean, the one that we've been discussing most here is if you have access to everyone's data, then you have the ability to cause harm on a global level. Knowing everyone's most personal information from
can
their
cause harm
social
to that
security
person.
number, you can very easily cause harm to anyone simply by looking at that data.
And I think, unfortunately, the Borg example immediately falls apart because they're not really individuals. They are a collective. And if you have a collective mentality, then data privacy is not a problem.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that? In a truly collectivist sense, data privacy is completely irrelevant.
In a collective like the Borg, where everyone shares thoughts, where the individuality has been lost entirely, then when you're talking about oneself, you're talking about the collective. You're not talking about any individual. Almost each member of the Borg that's been assimilated is more of a cell in a body.
You don't say, I am Borg. You say, we are Borg.
And you will be assimilated.
Even coming from an individual representative, you are still a part of the collective. So in this example, I think we may have gone too extreme, that the Borg is too extreme, because in that level of collectivism, data privacy is irrelevant. Would agreed?
Yeah.
Correct.
Okay, so let's try and tone it down a little bit. What about just a very, very open society? How about a bunch of hippies?
Yeah, a nudist colony somewhere in the woods
Actually,
of Oregon.
a nudist colony is
It's not a bad
good piece of
example at all.
information, because there it's maybe a little bit relevant of, hey, let's go swimming. Oh wait, when was your last period?
Right.
There might be sharks in these waters. This is actually relevant information now. So in a nudist colony, yeah, okay, I can see it. So I guess the context of the group matters for what type of data can be used nefariously.
But no matter what, that data can be used nefariously.
And I think whenever you have data privacy as not an absolute lack of necessity, that was not worded well. As long as you're not in a society where data privacy is irrelevant, so as soon as it becomes relevant, it can be used nefariously. Agreed?
I can see that.
Yeah.
Can we think of a minimum necessary example where data should be kept private? Or at least some data should be kept private. So maybe like one piece of information, like a social security number, that here is your piece of personal identifying information, or like a fingerprint or something that only you have that says you are you. I think that is about the most boiled down piece of data as you can get.
So a piece of data that identifies you is only useful if it's being checked against an entity that already knows that data.
That already knows the data, which means it would have already had to have been shared.
Yeah.
So even in the simplest case, there needs to be some data sharing.
Yeah. So if someone needs to confirm my identity based on my fingerprint or my social security number, they need to have my fingerprint or social security number on hand, or they just need to be really trusting, which is a different argument.
And I can conceptualize of a society where you or your identity is irrelevant, that you are a person, okay, I accept you as a person, and that gives you personhood, and that is literally it. So in a society where you have no social standing, so for instance, no credit score, no popularity, no history, then the data about you as a person is irrelevant.
I can definitely see that.
in that kind of a society, and I realize that we're using extreme examples here for now, in that kind of a society, is data privacy important? Or is being able to manage who gets to know information about you important?
I would argue, yeah. There is albeit I guess my biased point of view from our society, and it's hard to completely step into another society's shoes, but there is the factor of dignity. There are pieces of data that a lot of people would not want to share simply out of dignity and to maintain the respect of their peers.
But if you only have dignity for that particular interaction, and then the next interaction they have no idea who you are, what does it matter?
Yeah, like if you're changing names all the time, maybe people are face blind in this society, so they don't recognize you every time. So you're just a brand new person and you can say whatever you want.
So this is 4chan.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, in that case, you don't really care about the information. You care only about what they're saying. You only care about them in that interaction. And like 4chan, I don't want to use that as an example of something good, but there are areas of society where anonymity is used to a very strong degree, and people can interact based on ideas. That's one of the ideas behind free speech, is the person saying it shouldn't matter. What should matter is what's being said. And in that case, your data is irrelevant. It's not that it is important to keep it private, because then if it isn't kept private, then you get things like doxing. For those that don't know what doxing is, it's giving people's personally identifiable information, for instance, addresses, phone numbers, that sort of thing, and publicizing it for a nefarious purpose of saying, hey, go hurt this person, go bother this person. That's what doxing is. And in communities where anonymity is important, that sort of breach of data integrity is actually important. So in an anonymous society, maintaining that anonymity actually is very important. So I would argue that data integrity and data privacy is potentially more important.
Yeah.
Well, then you get into a case where if everybody's anonymous, what if one of those people makes a threat? Say they were going to bring a bomb to a large public event. What do you do then?
Or maybe not even make a threat, perform an action. Do something that is very wrong.
You don't just threaten to bring a bomb, you do bring a bomb somewhere and blow up a building.
And in a perfectly anonymous society, then there isn't any repercussions because no one could possibly know who did it if it's entirely anonymous.
So you can't prosecute crimes, which is, I think, one of the problems inherent in a truly anonymous society, and one of the problems with things like 4chan. If people do things that are illegal, it's very difficult to prosecute them. I mean, you can try and break the anonymity, but it becomes problematic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think that this is an interesting point in the sense that a society where data integrity or data privacy is unnecessary, where everyone is anonymous, so your previous data is completely irrelevant, that inherently causes problems because you can't prosecute any nefarious actors, and the rule of law basically goes away, because as soon as you regain your anonymity, your past goes away, and it would be a crime-ridden society, or at least not a society that is structured in a way that we can really currently conceptualize. So I think that arguably, based on the understanding of what we can perceptualize, a truly anonymous society where data is irrelevant is inherently problematic because of the lack of ability to prosecute.
Correct.
Yep.
And I mean, you can go deeper with this and try to work around that with some sort of higher moral and ethics board that makes decisions based on actions or intent to then de-anonymize and prosecute.
And then you're entrusting those people to not use their abilities and
Correct.
information nefariously, which absolute power corrupts absolutely. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a huge danger of centralizing power like that. But I think the point that we're learning here is that a society where data itself is not relevant does not work. Do we agree with that?
Yeah.
Not with humans the way that we are.
Not with humans as we know them currently. So, all right, data has to have meaning and it has to be available. There should be at least some information that's available to identify you. How known should that information be to everyone else?
I mean, I don't really want to go around with my name on my forehead.
So, all right, you remind me of one of the things I wanted to bring up. Sex offenders, people who are convicted sex offenders, convicted pedophiles, at least in the United States, are required to, when they move, go door to door to everyone in their community and tell people that they are sex offenders. That's an example of the government forcing people to give out very, very sensitive information that immediately paints you as, colloquially, a bad person. Is that something that you agree with? Do you think that that is an example of data that should not be able to be privatized?
I think in certain situations where someone has proven that they have intent to cause harm, allowing the community to know that this person that has caused harm in the past and may well cause harm again exists and is nearby is fair as a punishment for that past crime.
So the lack of data privacy is used as a punishment for the purpose of correction.
Correct.
That, hey, we know about you. We're going to make sure that it will be much more difficult for you to commit this act in the future, which I think is the purpose. Is if someone knows you have in the past sexually offended someone, if you are a convicted sex offender, that's what I want to say. If you are a convicted sex offender, other people knowing about it will change the way that they act around you, but it makes it less likely that you will end up performing those acts again.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to separate, this isn't, I guess, a slight deviation from the sex offender, but let's talk about pedophiles for a second.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of people in the world that are attracted to children, and many of them don't act on it due to their own moral standings and their own self-control.
Which I believe is referred to as a NOMAP, non-offending minor attracted person.
Yeah, and in those cases, if they are maintaining it and keeping it under control, there's nothing to quote unquote correct, as in a corrections type situation.
So for instance, that piece of data is held privately, but is not prosecutable because it hasn't been acted on.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes back kind of to our idea of motive and intent motive versus act.
Yeah. So in that case, you may be a person may be attracted to children, but knows better and knows that it's wrong to do any sort of action on it. So they exercise that self-control. That is something that shouldn't be made public as long as they maintain that control. If it is someone that has not been able to maintain that control, that's when it needs to be shared. I
definitely understand where you're getting at. Innocent until proven guilty.
Exactly.
Well, I guess the question of, can a person be guilty before an act, just based on the motive? And
well, not even motive, like someone
thoughts. Thought crimes a thing?
Yeah, correct. So if someone has a rape fantasy about raping another person and they have a dream about that, you don't really have control over what you dream about. You wake up, you may think to yourself, wow, like you might be confused, like I was sexually aroused by that, but I know that it was very wrong.
Sure. And on the flip side, there are people that have the other side of that dream, of dreaming about being raped.
And they're the same thing. Is like, I was sexually aroused by that, but I know it was it violated me intensely.
Mm-hmm.
So it is
the idea of a thought crime. And I think thought crimes are something we'll do an episode on that as well. But let's try and bring it back a little bit. The idea of the information about that thought is that thought is a piece of data. That you had this thought to go rape that child. That is a piece of data. Is it data that should be forced to be shared with other people?
Not unless you have intent to perform that action or you actually perform that action.
If you give someone the implication that you intend to act on it or you want to act on it, and like, hey, so not only do I have these feelings, but I want to act on them, that would be a case where someone could start to look into prosecution.
Yeah, and I mean, going even past the pedophile sense to try to make everyone think about this in their own, from their own perspective. Essentially, I'm going to guess the vast majority of adults, stealing is another example. I was going to just continue with sexual attraction. The vast majority of adults have seen another person walking down the street or seen a person on TV and thought about what it would be like to have sex with that person. Or like, I wonder what they look like naked. It's a very normal thought. It is the intent to then cause that, and like in a...
what you're saying is you should not be prosecuted for a thought rather than the intent. And that's fine. Again, I think that that's getting too deep into a different topic.
I just want to make the example that everyone, essentially everyone can relate to.
Everyone has those thoughts. So despite the fact that it is a point of data that you've had this thought, it's not a prosecutable point of data. And that's fine. So we shouldn't have to share thoughts. I think that what we're getting to is thoughts as points of data are not in and of themselves something that should be forced to be shared.
Correct. I can agree with that.
Your history, sure. Your actions, sure. Those are points of data that are relevant, as we talked about with the idea of anonymity. Your history should, to at least some degree, be shareable. Not necessarily your thoughts. I think that we're already at the point where, we agree thoughts are not fair for points of data. I can see examples where, like, hey, we're doing a study on how often people think about sex or how often people think about stealing. Sure, but that, I think, should be voluntary. In an individual society, sharing of thoughts should be voluntary.
Freedom of thought is really what you're getting at.
Yes. And moving forward with this topic, I think that that is something that we should leave out as the form of data. Or more specifically, it is points of data, but it should only be voluntarily shared. Your thoughts should be voluntarily shared. Agreed?
Agreed.
Yeah.
Cool. To what degree should data, and what I was kind of thinking about with bringing up the sex offender fact, is that is a point of data that legally has to be shared. So what we think of any other points of data that legally has to be shared?
In certain circumstances, yes. If you are diagnosed with HIV or AIDS, you are legally required, at least in the U.S., to let any and all partners know before you perform any acts with them that you have this disease and they are susceptible to it
because it's a lethal disease and you are putting them in danger of their life.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Is it not? And I realize we're talking a lot about sex in this, but that's, I think, because it's
a great example.
It's a good example of a taboo topic where people generally like to keep it private, but sometimes it's relevant to share. So to go off of the AIDS example, you're legally obligated to share that with someone. What about if you have herpes?
It's not deadly, and I don't think there's a specific law about it, but you should.
If I had herpes and I had a sexual partner, I would definitely let them know about that beforehand.
Yeah, but there are people out there that wouldn't, and that's wrong.
And that's nefarious.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's nefariously withholding data, your own data.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that we would agree that you can nefariously withhold data that you are not legally obligated to share.
Correct.
Yeah.
Is that equivalently bad to saying, so for instance, let's say the two of you decide that you're going to be getting sexually active, and I know that one of you has herpes. Is it nefarious of me to go behind someone else's back or breach their data privacy and tell the other person, hey, that one has herpes? Does that count as nefarious intent?
I mean, I would think that you are trying to look out for us.
True, you're doing it for the purpose of defending someone, and it's not that you would actively be harmed, but the act of withholding the information could cause you to be in a more detrimental situation, and I'm trying to prevent a person from being in a more detrimental situation, which makes it okay?
Yeah, it's kind of a weird point because I would much prefer if Cass told me rather than it coming from you.
I would agree with that. That hearing information from someone besides the person that it should be coming from is information in and of itself. That, well, this person wasn't going to tell me or hasn't told me yet. That is bad.
So, yeah. I think we need to break this down into multiple actions.
There was the act of not sharing.
There is the act of me not sharing that I have herpes. There was the act of D. No.
App.
No, D.
Oh, me.
D, knowing that information and watching out for app safety in telling app, hey, by the way, Cast has herpes. And then, so the action of me not telling was bad. The action of breaking privacy, my privacy, was bad, but the intent was good.
The intent was to protect app from unknowingly getting involved in something that would be viewed as detrimental by her.
Yeah. So there is good and bad to it. It's just like killing a murderer, killing Mao. Killing is wrong. Killing Mao might save a lot of lives. It's the trolley problem.
Exactly. And man, we went from herpes to Mao. That was a jump. But yeah, I think I agree with that. That for breach of privacy for the purpose of protecting someone is acceptable. Can we think of an example where that is not acceptable? I can think of an example. Let's say the President of the United States has herpes. I know that. And I know that that the president likes to kiss people. And so I just decide I'm going to give a public service announcement, tell everyone in the world that they have herpes. If I'm doing it to try and protect someone, but that could have a nefarious intent of making the president look bad.
I mean, there is the idea of oversharing.
Sure. Mm-hmm. So, and should I then be responsible if I overshare? And I think that based on what we've been saying, yes. If I am sharing, I should share it with the minimum necessary force. I should share it with the minimum number of people that it's actually necessary to protect. I know that the two of you are going to be making out later. I know that one of you has herpes, so I'm going to tell the other person and make sure that they're aware of it. I don't have to tell the entire world that.
Correct. Yeah.
And note, yes, this is completely hypothetical.
And it is, to an extent, it is not, just because you know the information, it's not always your responsibility to share the information or your right to share the information.
Absolutely. And for something where it's maybe more of an emotional burden. So, for instance, if I know of, let me think.
Here, I have an example.
Go ahead.
Let's say that I have a deep depression. And it's something that I've struggled with my whole life. And I'm getting into a new relationship with App, because that's been the existing example.
You two are such
I'm
a
getting
cute
into
couple.
a new relationship. And I know that App has a past partner that maybe committed suicide because of a deep depression.
You bringing up depression would be a very touchy topic. And if I decide to insert myself into your relationship and say, hey, so App, he has depression and has for all of his life,
I'd probably go running.
Yeah.
Right. In which case, I have maliciously hurt Cast.
Yeah.
So I think it is possible to share data against someone's will for the purpose of trying to protect one person, but I end up hurting another person.
Yeah.
And am I responsible for that because I was trying to protect someone in the process?
Yeah. You, any nefarious action done in the name of good.
Not nefarious.
Well,
it's more like negligence.
Yeah. Well, any action that causes harm, even with the intent to do good, is still an action that caused harm, and therefore you're
prosecutable. I think it should be weighed in of like, I honestly thought that this would be good. Mm-hmm. I had reason to believe it would be good. It ended up being bad. I think that intent should play a part.
Yeah, in this case, I can definitely agree with that because you were genuinely trying to help someone.
And sometimes, for instance, if someone's murdering someone, sometimes you have to hurt the person that's trying to commit the murder. in order to stop them.
Yeah, but
So-
it should be done with minimum
necessary force.
Yeah,
Yep.
so if you bust in to someone that, like, let's say not murdering someone, let's say someone's robbing someone, and you run over there and you shoot the robber in the head, you have gone to the extreme and you're definitely prosecutable.
Yeah, sure. And I think that when it comes to social examples, like we were talking about, of, hey, I have information that I know that he was depressed earlier, and you may want to take that into consideration because I know you had a previous boyfriend that killed himself. Yeah, I think it's it's all contextual, and it's a really blurry line. But I think what we're trying to get at is, how does that play into data privacy? Of, should you be able to share information about someone in order to try to protect another person?
I really think it's a judgment call in every situation. We can't sit here and boil every single possible situation down. It plays down to a judgment call. It plays down to that judgment call on whether or not the, I'm going to say, crime of sharing the data when you may not have the right to.
You are responsible for the outcomes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whether that be good or bad or both. There could be a good outcome there and a bad outcome. Look at the I guess more like an example of, you let App know that I'm depressed, and in so doing, she decides to break off any romantic interest. That leads my depression to be deeper and deeper, and ultimately
You could kill yourself.
Right.
And I may not be responsible for the depression, but I am at least partially responsible for you killing yourself. And I think that, yeah, the weights to which we put on people based on those actions, it's more of a societal and a social thing rather than a prosecutable legal thing. But there are a lot of blurry lines out there. I think that what we're boiling it down to is the axiom that if you decide to breach someone's data privacy, regardless of the intent, you are responsible for the actions. Or you are responsible for the outcomes to at least some degree.
I would just say I don't think we need to add to some degree. I think you're responsible for the outcomes.
If you breach privacy, you are responsible for the outcomes.
Correct.
Yeah.
Especially if it's for someone else. If it's for you, you're probably the one that will be negatively affected. But if it's for someone else, you are responsible for the ramifications of it.
Yeah.
And I think that in most legal cases where that actually has become a problem, while there are different levels of leniency, like again the comparison between murder and manslaughter, because intent does play a role, you will likely be prosecuted in some way for it.
Yeah. I think we could boil it down further and just say everyone is responsible for their own actions.
Yes, and in this case, that action is the sharing of data.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But just digging deeper and going past the data privacy, just looking at its general axiom, you are responsible for your actions.
Sure. I would agree with that. So related to this, and the sharing of other people's data coming up in the news and law lately, at least at the time of this recording, there is debate over whether or not people that are sharing their medical history should be able to share the medical history of their family members. So for instance, if I'm genetically predisposed to have a heart condition, that means that one of my parents is genetically predisposed to have a heart condition. That is sharing data about my parents. Do I have the right to do that?
I think part of that depends on who you're sharing it with.
Does it matter?
I would argue based on
If I'm,
what we've discussed
I guess
so
if I'm
far.
telling an insurance salesman that is looking to also make money off of my parents, well, then I may have not a nefarious, but I may have a negative effect on my parents because of that.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but if it's actually for your healthcare, that's really useful information.
And I think that the more useful information is, the more nefariously it can be used, and the more likely we are to say this information should be private. But I think that it's kind of a catch-22, that the more valuable information is, the more we want to keep it private, but the more we keep it private, the less valuable it becomes. Because data is only usable when it is in the form of information.
Yeah, I would say making the statement that the more useful the usefulness of the data for every I want to word this as the possible benefit of a piece of data, as the possible benefit of a piece of data increases, so does the possible detriment if used in the wrong way.
And I agree with that. And so I think that we should be careful in terms of how likely it is for someone to be able to nefariously use something or use something in a way that causes a negative outcome for someone.
And in these cases, we should look at thinking about if you have agreed to share your data or maybe even shared your family history, which includes data on other people, then if you've done this, then what responsibilities do the person that you've shared this data with have, or the person or entity that you shared this
Maintaining data
data?
integrity.
Yeah,
So,
maintain the integrity and maintain privacy.
So, for instance, healthcare organizations, they frequently have information. Like, they probably know when your last period was. They probably know if you have herpes. They may know if you're a rapist.
And they'll know your social security number.
They'll know your social security number. So they'll have a lot of information on you. And we should probably be holding those organizations to a very high standard of you need to keep personal healthcare information, PHI, very secure, because we view that as important data.
Yeah, I'm gonna say one thing. So in the U.S., the term PHI is used. I like the European PII, personally identifying information. That's much better.
I think they are completely different things. So the reason I say that is personal health information. That is, for instance, do I have herpes?
Yeah.
That's not personally identifiable. My social security number is. I think that they are inherently different things. There's going to be some overlap there, but PHI is just your health information.
So what I'm getting at though is that the identifying portion is the important part. If you have a database that simply has a single data point for every person that says herpes or not, and no other information on that person, it's not identifiable. You may be able to see the
if
percentage.
If you take the
of people.
conglomerate of all of your pieces of health information, that will narrow it down to literally just you.
Yes, correct.
So
everyone is significantly different. Therefore, your health record is identifying information, but singular pieces of it may not be.
So you cannot have PIDs, personally identifiable data. But once that data is conglomerated into like a profile, you can have a PIP, a personally identifiable profile, where even if it doesn't have your name, it is enough to correlate to just specifically you.
Or to an extent that it is very easy to figure out who, like, you could narrow it down to a total of 5 people.
Oh, I know you live in this city and you're of this age. You are of this sex, and a couple other pieces of information. With really 10 pieces of information, depending on how meaningful they are, you can probably identify most people.
Yeah. And so that's why I like to make the distinction between PHI and PII. PHI is talking about all the individual data points that go into a person's health record.
And PII can expand outside of your health record.
Correct. So like in the case of a health record, knowing your social security number for the purposes of providing healthcare, it's not needed, because my social security number is nothing but an identifying number.
They want to know who you are in comparison to someone else, that they don't give medication to the wrong person.
If they have my health record in front of them, then they already know that it's me. There's nothing that having my social security number is going to do to benefit that. And that's why it's not PHI, but that's PII. And
to be fair, the social security number can be helpful in actually caring for you. It's really hard to match patients in the U.S. Like really, really hard.
So I'm saying, like, as part of that treatment, if someone has my entire health record already, they know it's me. What benefit does them knowing my social security number does?
That's the thing, is if you go to another hospital, there could be other casts there who have similar birth dates to you. They may live in the same town as you. Having your social security number can be extremely helpful to match a patient, especially because there are things like if you spell out Lane versus just LN, a computer may not be smart enough to tell that those are the same thing.
Yeah. So I'm talking more about in the instant of providing care, whether or not that information is actually useful once you've identified the person.
Once you've identified, yes. Yeah. But personally identifiable information is incredibly important for identifying the person personally.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, after that point of, say, like, pulling your record over, you've got an armband, okay, I can maybe see like your nurse doesn't need your social security number.
The armband would then identify you as that person, and that is sensitive data, but it's not as sensitive as a social security number because outside of that context, it's not as useful. So I think that armbands, which for those of you that aren't aware, I believe that the armband will just have a barcode on it that you can scan, and all you need to have is that barcode, and you can identify, yes, this is patient X, and they are getting medication that is intended for patient X, so that you don't mix up medications. And no one involved, besides that first person that scans in the barcode, will even know their social security number. And I think that we keep coming back to social security number because it's a very important piece of data.
In the U.S.
Yeah.
In the U.S.
You're looking at other countries. Every country has some sort of national identifying number of some sort. Sometimes it's, in the UK, you have your national insurance ID, but not everyone has one of those, actually. It's a weird system, but thinking about if you are outside the U.S., think about some number that your government, your health care organization, or something like that gives you that is completely unique to you and could be used against you. If
anything that uniquely identifies you. Driver's licenses have a unique number associated with them. In the U.S., social security numbers. In other countries,
national insurance IDs, etc.
Sure. Something that identifies you as a specific individual in a single data point. I think that's the critical piece that we're looking for, is one point of data that can identify you. There is information, for instance, your medical history, that can identify you, but that is not as highly sensitive as your social security number or driver's license number that can pinpoint it down to you.
Well, not for everyone. I mean, think about the case of a rare disease where there is only one known person in the world to have this disease.
I'm saying standard for everyone.
For most people.
Yeah.
Everyone or most people have this particular piece of data, and that piece of data is one of the most important things that you have because it can personally identify you. And I think the reason we have so much, why we handle that so carefully, is because of how nefariously it can be used. A research organization saying, "Oh, here are all the social security numbers we have." That's actually not very useful information, because you might be able to tell, I think, approximately where they're from and around their date of birth. So there is information that you can get out of it. But my point is, to a healthcare organization, I care much more about what is your genetic code. How often have you been sick? How have you been eating? That information is wildly more important than, hey, I want to be able to impersonate you, so give me your social security number.
Yeah. And the argument on why social security numbers are just terrible and how they were designed is definitely for a later discussion, or you could just look at CGP Gray's video on YouTube of why social security numbers are terrible. Highly recommend it. But stepping aside from that, the point of a single identifying piece of information, a single data point that can identify you across the entire world, that's the kind of data that needs to be protected on its own, whereas sets of data that can't do the same thing are the piece that may be useful in certain contexts, could be, as I said, useful in some contexts. Trying to map the spread of a disease or symptoms that a lot of members of a society are seeing. I think of the Flint water crisis, where it took the ability of a system to report on the data of all of these cases of lead poisoning in children to then map it to a single source, being the water supply, as providing this lead. So just because you have a list of patients, their approximate locations, and whether or not they had lead poisoning, doesn't mean you can identify them down to the individual level, but it does allow you to find this pattern that says, hey, we have a problem with lead in our water.
Right. And what you're talking about is the idea of anonymized data, that the personally identifiable data, the points of data that can individually identify a person and allow you to impersonate that person, were not used in those studies. So this raises a question. Should information or pieces of data that cannot individually be used to identify an individual or identify you as an individual? So in other words, if I have a piece of data about app, and me having that one piece of data would not allow me to impersonate her, is that data that needs to be protected?
What if you have that one piece of data, maybe knowing I go to X gym isn't that important, but you can probably piece together other things about me to track me down from other data aggregation networks. So, great example. Google can probably identify me just because of how many things they know about me.
I believe there was some like AI interpretation of based on when people use Facebook. Facebook algorithms can predict when people are having poops, and that's data because like, hey, we know when people are pooping, but that is not what the information was intended for, and it's just based off of when do you log on.
Right. There's a lot of stuff like that where I don't really want Facebook to know when I'm doing that, but because of my patterns, they know. There's a lot of information that they can gather from what little they have.
But the difference that I'm trying to get at here is, the fact that Facebook knows when you poop, does that mean that Facebook can impersonate you? Can they open a credit card saying, well, I poop at these times of day? Sure, that's information. The credit card company is going to look at you and be like, okay, do you have social
do you have
security
numbers about this person?
Exactly. There are certain pieces of information or certain pieces of data that companies will look for to identify you. So are those other pieces of data, like knowing when you poop, it doesn't matter because they can't impersonate you off of that.
But I don't like the idea that somebody knows all of my habits and knows where I'm going to be.
Why not?
Because to me, that kind of opens the door to people really tracking me in kind of a Big Brother scenario.
So, for instance, a stalking situation. Well, I know when you poop. I know when you go to the gym. I know when you cook dinner. And now I can start following you around.
Exactly.
Stalk you. Okay. No. Yes, that data could be used for nefarious purposes. The fact that you go to work on a regular basis, and let's say you have a 9-to-5 job, that's fairly well known, and that can be used for stalking. Pretty much any piece of information can be used for stalking. Does that mean that all information that could possibly be used for a nefarious purpose needs to be limited?
That's why I want to keep it private and let people have it. Because if there are some companies where it's like, okay, I know you were doing medical research. And
so hold on. Let's bring it back to the Facebook thing.
Mm-hmm.
You log in, and so they can estimate when you're pooping. They need to know when you're logging in. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So they're using data that they need to know, and they have ready access to. It's not identifying you personally. They can't impersonate you. They may not even know your name.
You're saying Facebook. I have a lot of problems with Facebook.
Well, I'm just using an example. I don't care. I don't care if you use it or not. I'm saying that them knowing when you poop, it might be useful for them. It's completely irrelevant to you. It's really personal that they know when I'm pooping.
Exactly.
But because it's personal, does that mean that it shouldn't be shareable?
Goes back to what I said earlier about dignity. There's a certain level of dignity to maintaining your own knowledge of when you poop and when you don't poop.
If Facebook, and I'm giving a lot of credit to Facebook here, if Facebook is able to correlate when people poop relative to the different types of meals that they eat based on what food they post and pictures of food that they post, all of that information is actively, you are putting this on Facebook. If they can determine, hey, we noticed that a bunch of people started pooping after they went to this restaurant. Maybe we should send a health inspector there to say, hey guys, we think that you just poisoned a bunch of people, or a bunch of people got food poisoning from this particular shipment. There's a lot of good to the society that can come out of that. Now, do I think that Facebook is going to try and go out of their way to help society in that way? Probably not, unless it's profitable to them. But is there anything inherently wrong, or is just losing a little bit of dignity by the fact that someone or some algorithm somewhere knows that you're pooping right now? Is that loss of dignity? Does it matter at all?
Yes. Because dignity is something, dignity is a human right, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's how I feel about it. It's just, that's not something I want people to know. Yes, I know it may be a big computer somewhere, and there's not really a single person that knows this about me, but it still just feels so wrong.
And the other thing...
Hold on. Do your feelings trump my ability to use data valuably?
No.
So I want to say one thing is that you're using data, you're causing harm. It goes back to...
Is loss of dignity harm?
Yes.
Emotional harm.
Yeah.
Which I know goes back around.
Science doesn't care about your feelings.
Yeah. But we aren't science.
Science is what we make of it.
So science...
If we had to stop scientific research because of people's feelings, we would get nowhere.
That's where... But what I'm saying is that just because you're causing harm to someone doesn't mean you aren't doing something in the name of good. What we were talking about earlier, where you share a piece of information about me even though you probably shouldn't in order to help another person, you are responsible for those actions. Facebook is responsible for how they use the data, whether that's data that you've actively given them or data that they've inferred from data that you've given them through an algorithm or through just however they want to infer that data.
And if they are inferring that data off of data that you willingly gave them, you willingly give them your login time, that is their data and that's their information.
Well, no,
the fact that they know it,
information that they have on you.
They
it's
are
your data ultimately.
But they're generating no, it's your data, but it's data that you have willingly given them. You've willingly put pictures of this particular type of food. You willingly logged in to a website. They know when you log in. That's all the data that they have, and if they can glean information out of that, how does that hurt you?
I think, inferred data should be protected and used just like data that you've given them. So
inferred information. And again, this comes back to what I brought up earlier, the difference between data and information. Data are just the singular contact points.
And that's what's being inferred here.
No.
If you can infer...
you log in. That's
yes.
The only pieces of data that they get is login times. And if they manage to be able to infer pooping times...
Pooping time is a single point of data. Time of poop. That's an inferred piece of
data. That's a point of information.
Yeah. They're not directly measuring the amount of time you're spending on a toilet.
They're also not confirming it. So, for instance, if they then requested saying, hey, did you poop at this time? You absolutely have the right to ignore that. And in that case, if they then started recording you and they started using the camera on your phone to determine, is this person actually in a bathroom? That is a breach of privacy. That is a data privacy breach because they're going through it by means which you did not consent to.
Yeah.
But the inference based on data that you have willingly given them, I don't think that any of the inferences that are made off of willingly shared data is bad. Unless it's used to harm the person.
Right. I don't think that inferring information from given data is bad. I just think it needs to be...
Facebook making a post on your behalf and saying this person is pooping right now, that can get you in trouble.
Right.
If you're not if you're not supposed to be on a break, that can have a negative consequence, and Facebook should be held liable for that. But if they just say 1,500 people are pooping right now, that isn't going to negatively affect an individual. It's inferred and it's information that comes out of data that was willingly shared. I see nothing wrong with that.
All I'm saying is that data needs to be, the information inferred needs to be protected, just like the data that you've given them.
It should remain as anonymous enough that it doesn't negatively affect the person that it came from.
I could understand that, especially with this pooping example where, if they're just telling me 1,500 users, okay, I don't know who these users are. I don't know where they are. Okay.
Here are your fellow pooping buddies.
Right. That would be kind of awkward if it told me exactly who else was doing the same thing.
Yeah, if it told you there are 1,500 people in your city that are also pooping right now, and your population is 2,000. Okay.
There might be a health problem going around.
Well, but then you can identify who's poisoning the water hole. So, I think that App, you seem to be starting to agree with me that as long as the information remains anonymized and the data was not nefariously gathered, that there's nothing inherently wrong with that. As soon as you start to de-anonymize the information, that's when you start getting into the problem of things like doxing or oversharing information to the detriment of the person that you're sharing information about. Agreed?
I think to a point, big thing is for me is just sheer number of data points. It would be extremely easy to figure out like my daily schedule just because of like places I check in. There's very obvious key card on my lanyard for the gym, things like that. So knowing a whole bunch of different things about me altogether, I'm not the biggest fan of. But like the one data point of when I log into Facebook and you are just putting it in a jumble with a whole bunch of other ones, okay.
And I'm going to have to defend large corporations. If you are using a service, for instance, like Facebook, and you are giving them pieces of data through using their service, the information that they glean from that is something that you have inherently consented to. It's, for instance, your daily schedule. If a company knows enough about you that you use an app so religiously that a company can say exactly what you're doing and when, they have a lot of power over you. Or potentially they have a lot of power over you, and they could use it for nefarious purposes. But by using those, by benefiting from those services, you are consenting to that risk.
I can definitely agree with consenting to that risk. One of the problems, though, with a lot of those services is that you don't necessarily have a choice about the level of sharing. It's, okay, well, you can share your location data all the time. Or not at all, unless you upgrade to Android 10. But, like, that was a big thing that bothered me, was there was no, okay, I just want to use this app for some maps right now, and then I don't want you to track me after I'm done with it.
Sure. So you want to be able to limit the amount of data collection.
Right.
And this kind of comes back to one of our earlier points of if you can selectively choose what data you present, that can make the data gathered completely irrelevant. Which, to be fair, if it's your data, maybe that company just won't be able to use the data. That if we as a society do not entirely consent to the use of a particular type of data, then we should not be able to glean the benefits from the information that could come from that data. For instance, if we have algorithms that can process the data, the location data of literally everyone that has a smartphone, maybe there's something really, really good, and maybe we can improve traffic by doing that. And sending a notification of, hey, you should get on the road right now, and sending a notification to someone else saying, hey, you should go on the road in 10 minutes. We might be able to solve traffic problems by analyzing that location data. But if we as a society are not comfortable with everyone else knowing our location, then that is our vote of, no, we're not going to know this information or whatever information could come from this because we're not comfortable with it yet. I think that we vote with how much data we're willing to share. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You pause it.
Okay, so if we vote with what information we should have access to by saying what data are we willing to share, to what degree are the companies that provide services responsible for allowing us to limit the data that they can gather?
I mean, I really want it to be super granular myself so that way I can say, okay, I know.
As a user.
Right. As a user, using maps is a great example here where, okay, I understand you need to use my location when I am using GPS directions.
Yep.
But I don't necessarily need you to know, every single place I go within a building.
Sure.
So I want to keep that off when I'm not explicitly asking for directions.
And to be fair, you could just go on and turn off location services every time you're not using them. And it may be an inconvenience, but it's an inconvenience that you have the ability to turn off that data gathering aspect.
Yes.
And I think that
oftentimes those settings can be difficult to find, but they often exist.
Let's say that you can't turn location services off. That by having a smartphone, you say, I'm going to benefit from this. And while I acknowledge that this company will be able to track me wherever I go, I am willing to give that data up for the benefits that I can glean from it.
I think that's okay as long as you understand this is what I'm giving up.
To what degree do you have to understand that?
I think that's tricky
Do you,
because
do you think a 13-year-old kid actually understands
Oh, no.
what they're consenting to?
absolutely not. They're not going to understand just how much data they are giving up by doing this.
So consent is important.
Yeah.
If you are unable to consent, if you're not old enough to consent or you don't have the capability to consent, should data be not gathered? So, for instance, can we not gather any data whatsoever on children unless the parents consent?
Honestly, I think that's a good idea.
So yeah,
But then how do we, for instance, find out information of like there's an epidemic that is only affecting people in a recent generation or younger individuals? Like there are some major.
Well, in those cases, if that type of data is being, let's say, taken to at a hospital, it's the parents or the guardian's responsibility to take those children, and there is a consent done in that process.
By the parents.
Yeah, the parents are consenting to taking their child to the hospital and having whatever studies done on them.
So by exposing the kids to a way that they can share data, the parents are consenting for them. So if the parents get their kid a smartphone, the parents are consenting to the kids using location services.
To an extent, yeah. And I will clarify one thing that you said earlier is consent without an understanding of what you're consenting to is not real consent.
How many times have you consented to a terms of service without reading it?
Way too many.
So is that not real consent?
It's not. There are several court cases about that.
Are you saying that you're being raped by Apple?
I don't use Apple services.
I don't know who would. Well, there goes half of our audience. Let's be honest, maybe a 5%.
Probably.
If only we had data to see what kind of devices people are listening to this podcast on.
Oh, and here goes the comment section of, I use Android. I never use Apple. I only use Apple. Derp-a-der.
Yep.
Okay, so anyway, you said that there were some lawsuits going on about terms of service. If the person doesn't actually read them, then they can't be held to them. Right?
Yeah, to an extent. If you don't know what you're consenting to, then it's not real consent.
So even lawyers that have trouble reading and interpreting the terms of service, even they can't technically consent, which means that when you have really complicated laws, can anyone ever consent?
No.
That's a little oversimplified.
Yeah, I think that oversimplifies it quite a bit because it is, as I said, you have to understand what you're consenting to. It doesn't mean you have to understand everything that you could possibly consent to. But if someone comes up and says, would you like to have sex with me? And I say, yes, I consent to having sex with you or some equivalent, and we have sex, I don't need to know every law about sex and all of that. I just need to know that.
But if you don't understand all the ramifications, so for instance, if you didn't realize that you could get an STD from sex, but you did consent, but you didn't understand what you were consenting to and the risk of STDs, does that mean that you didn't actually consent?
I was consenting to the action of sex, and in that consent, it is my responsibility to deal with the outcomes of what I'm consenting to.
But if you didn't understand it, so, and this is the point that I'm getting at, if you didn't understand what you were consenting to exactly, does that burden fall on the person that is trying to do the understanding? Because if, in the example of sex, if I'm young and I don't realize that I could get an STD, but I consent to sex, afterwards, can the consent then be revoked because I didn't understand it?
In that situation, I think we need to take into account the age of consent.
Let's say I am of age, but I just didn't understand that I could get STDs.
I mean, that's hard because if you don't understand that you can get STDs, you just don't know what you are getting into, and realistically, it's probably going to end poorly for you.
Right, but I think it's your fault for not educating yourself before taking part in an action. I think that if you are consenting to it, you abdicate.
You by providing consent, you are putting the responsibility on yourself to fully understand what you're consenting to.
Yes, you are taking responsibility for your actions.
Yeah.
And terms of service, I think, is the same thing. Even if you haven't read it, you have consented to it. If it says in there that Apple can turn you into a human centipede, you've consented to it. Now, there are other legal ramifications, like actually then going through with hooking someone's mouth up to another person's butt and creating a human centipede, and you can revoke consent. So that's an important aspect, that you can revoke consent. But if the action has already happened after you gave consent, before you revoked consent, the action, I think, is valid.
Yeah, and at least thinking about it in the case of data, you're not really going to be getting that data back. They already have it.
And so, actually, no, that's a good question. If I consent to giving someone data, and then I revoke consent, I think I revoke consent to the future gathering of data, but they can still have the data because I had consented to it and it's theirs.
Well, it's maybe in this country. In the Netherlands, a patient has the right to have the healthcare organization completely destroy their data if they ask to. And it's a difficult process to do, but it is their legal right to say, I want you to remove and delete all data you have on me.
And that can also be problematic if you have HIV or some other very infectious, or if you have a very infectious disease and you say, I want you to wipe out all data on me. That can be really problematic because it can put everyone else in the population at risk. So I think that once you consent to giving away certain aspects of your data, I guess the question is, should that data remain public and out of your direct control?
Public, probably not the right word.
Sure.
But should the company still have it?
If I consent to them to be able to use it, and then I remove that consent, they can no longer gather additional data, but I also have not consented anymore to them sharing that data. They may be able to use the data, but not share it.
I could live with that. I would ideally like the option to delete my data, but, if they're not sharing it with anybody anymore, okay.
So I'm going to throw a wrench in my own statement. What if I give them data, and then I revoke consent, and I say, okay, look, I don't want you gathering any more data on me. Then, based on the data that they did gather with me and a bunch of other people, they do some scientific research, come up with a very important result, and need to publish that result, and they need to publish the data sets. It's anonymized data, but they did use the data and then publish the data along with everyone else's for the purpose of publishing a scientific paper. I consented to giving them the data, and they're using it for reasons that I had consented to previously. I think that is still technically valid because I consented to the use of that data, and they are using that data as I consented to it.
So you're talking about you're talking about revoking consent, but when you say revoke, like
revoking consent to the gathering of data.
Yeah.
And in revoking that, I also revoke consent of using the data in any way that I didn't originally agree to.
Okay.
So if I agree to say, yes, you can collect data and you can use it for scientific research, and then I revoke consent, they can no longer collect data. They can keep using it for scientific research, the data that they had gathered, but if they then want to start selling it to people, I did not consent to that at any point. Agreed?
Yeah. There's different parts of consent here. Consenting for them to collect or have your data, consenting for them to use your data.
And the ways that I consent for them to use my data.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So when you say revoke consent, you do mean blocking them from obtaining any more data on you and blocking them from using your data beyond the purposes that you originally...
But we actually, I just remembered we were talking earlier about the idea of pooping. I don't consent to you knowing when I poop, but I consent to you knowing when I log in. So that is information. And I think that they can use the information in whatever way they want to gain information. I think the point where it becomes contentious, and maybe our next portion of the topic, is making money. If I consent to them gathering data, but not making money off of it, then I revoke consent, and then they start selling it. Should that be not permitted?
I don't think it should be permitted because I did not say that they could sell my data.
You didn't consent to it.
Right.
But you did consent to giving them the data.
Right. But I wasn't expecting them to sell it.
Doesn't matter. It's their data. It's data about you, but anonymized in such a way that it won't negatively directly affect you.
But it still kind of goes back to the point I made earlier about how if one group can collect a ton of data about me, they can re-identify me.
Sure. In which case, personally identifying you and trying to impersonate you, that is a crime in and of itself. And that can be prosecutable. And they're responsible for that nefarious action.
Is it a crime, or do you think it should be a crime to Is it a crime, or do you think it should be a crime to de-anonymize data that has been purposely anonymized? So if I am an entity and I have these 5 different data sets that are all anonymized, and with any single one I can't narrow down to an individual.
If you try to use that data and correlate it to narrow it down to an individual
without any express intent to cause harm, or maybe not even cause any harm itself, but simply to de-anonymize a piece of data, is that wrong?
If I think that a person may be interested in a particular product, and I look at a series of data and say, I want to target this person for my product, and send them an advertisement. Gathering data, using data that is legally gathered, should I be able to target an advertisement at that person? It's another good question that's come up in this particular topic recently.
Yeah, in that case, I mean, it's not as concerning because they haven't truly identified me as me. They know as, oh, this person likes to hike, so we should show them hiking advertisements.
Sure. And that is useful for the person that likes to go hiking because it gets them connected to new things that they may not have known about. It can be annoying if you search for one thing on Google and all of a sudden every single advertisement on Facebook is for that one thing that you searched for and had already bought, and you still see advertisements for it. It can be really annoying, but it's not hurting me.
Well, it could. So using that data...
Actually, I have a good example for how it could. Father finding out that his daughter was pregnant. Mm-hmm. His underage daughter was pregnant because she searched for pregnancy test, and then that came up on his Target or Amazon or something.
It was definitely Target.
Yeah, and then it's like, oh, you should get some diapers. And he's like, I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, that case is really interesting because the daughter was doing things online that were, through whichever algorithm it was fed through, made it pretty clear that she was pregnant or possibly pregnant. So Target sent...
To be fair, the parents should know about that so that they can help her out.
I mean, it's still her data, but Target sent a flyer that said, hey, here are different things for baby supplies and whatnot. And then the parents saw that and like, what the fuck? And yeah, that is... I mean, that was entirely unintentional because their algorithms weren't meant to expose
but they
the
were
truth,
doing it for the intent of trying to help someone. And while they may end up having negative ramifications, and maybe they should be held responsible in some way, maybe socially, of like, hey, so you really upset this girl and made her life a lot more stressful because her parents now know about it. It's like the parents were probably going to find out anyway. So she wasn't really in a different situation. Arguably, she's in a better situation because the parents know about it earlier and can actually help her out with that. But harm did not come to that person.
I mean, there's a breach.
Emotional harm, yes, but it's emotional harm that probably would have happened anyway. But
it could have been in a controlled situation.
Yeah.
This really does go back to dignity. Like if I choose to share my information with someone, I'm doing so because I trust them, and I would probably do so in a way that's going to preserve my dignity. Now, if someone else shares that same piece of information in a different way or goes behind my back to do that, that hurts my dignity a lot more. So there is a argument there that people have a right to their own dignity, and they have a right to share their own information at the time that they see fit, as long as they're not going to be causing harm by delaying the...
I don't know if I agree to people having the right to their own dignity.
That's part of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. All people...
If I feel embarrassed, my dignity is hurt. Do I have a right to not feel embarrassed?
No, people feel embarrassed. That's a pretty standard thing.
It
Yeah,
hurts my
they're your
dignity.
feelings.
If people laugh at me, that hurts my dignity.
They're causing harm, is what I'm trying to get at here.
So should people not be allowed to laugh at each other? Because I guess that's what I'm interpreting as you have a right to dignity, and we're getting we're getting off topic here, so I think we can reel it back in. But I'm just saying, like, I don't necessarily agree with that premise, but I don't think it's entirely relevant to what we're talking about. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so to bring it back in, I think it was Target or something. Should they be held responsible for upsetting a girl who was already in a stressful situation? And how should they be held responsible? Okay, we now know that Target is responsible for tattling on this girl to her dad unintentionally. I think that is the punishment for the company, is the social ramifications around that. The fact that now that is a company that has this little piece of data with it. We have that piece of data and that piece of information, that this is something that can happen based on the algorithms that they're using. If we're not okay with that, we'll start protesting. We may just not buy items from that store for fear of, oh, I am not going to search for baby supplies because I don't want my parents to think that I'm getting pregnant. Okay. That's perfectly valid. That's something that we can do as a society as a ramification, but I think that the ramification for emotional harm should be what comes based on the societal decision.
Yeah, and in this case, I can agree with that. I don't think legally there's really anything to do.
Well, yeah, what are you going to prosecute him for? Or
Right.
or what would the punishment be? Oh, you need to pay for all the child care?
Yeah, that's not really going to do much.
And it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I agree with that there's not really anything legally that can be done. But that doesn't mean that I don't know what I'm going to say. I need to think about this more.
All right, so we've gone on to a lot of different topics here. You can have time to think. That's fine. What I'm thinking is there are probably other aspects that we have missed in this episode, but we've covered a lot. We've gone in depth for a lot of those topics. So I think let's call it here. And if we need to come back and do a follow-up episode, we definitely can, or an addendum. I'm perfectly fine with that. But I think let's summarize at this point. Everyone good with that?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. So if you consent to someone else gathering data on you, they can use that data to gather whatever information they wish, assuming it does not negatively affect the person that you gained the data from. And if it does negatively affect that person, then the people who gathered the data are responsible for the ramifications to some degree. You know, depending on if it's a social punishment or a judicial punishment. The punishment may vary, which is why I say to some degree, but the person who created the situation that caused the negative ramification to the person the data is about, they are responsible for that information and for the negative ramifications. Agreed?
Yeah.
Also, while personally identifiable information and personally identifiable data that, for instance, a social security number, a national insurance number, or a driver's license number, that can identify you, and it can be used to impersonate you. Impersonation is wrong because you can avoid crimes that you've committed. You can frame other people for crimes that they didn't commit and negatively affect other people. You are responsible for those ramifications. Identity theft is bad, and we need to, as a society, be careful around the pieces of data that could lead to identity theft. Agreed?
Agreed.
Yep.
That being said, data in general, including personally identifiable data, is critical to society, because if you have a truly anonymous society, then there's nothing that would allow crimes to be prosecutable, and society would likely largely devolve. So you need personally identifiable data, which means you need to be at risk of having identity theft, but we need to be careful to prevent identity theft. But identity theft is very different than use of data, and as long as that data is consented to, and there are no negative ramifications that come back to the person that it comes from, no harm done. Agreed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the only other thing that we brought up was the idea of thought. That while doing scientific research on thoughts and ideas may be relevant, that must be consented to directly for each thought. That data about a person, skin color, when their last period was, their health history, those are all pieces of data that you can actively consent to, but consenting to sharing thoughts as points of data can be very, very dangerous, because if that's used against you, even if you didn't act on it, that brings up into question lots of other moral questions. So I think that thoughts should not be used as points of data except for very specific circumstances. Agreed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. So I think that covers all the topics that we hit on. But it does leave one question in my mind. App. When was the last time you had a period? The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.